StudyJesus.com presents Bible Stories, where biblical stories of the ages come alive.
Jesus now leaves the cities and goes with his disciples into Ephraim, which is near the wilderness. And Jesus stayed here until it was time for the Passover feast, and then he and his disciples started again for Jerusalem. As they passed through the village of Samaria, they saw 10 men. 9 of these men were children of Israel, and 1 was a Samaritan. They didn't come close to Jesus or his disciples because these men were lepers, and by law they had to avoid people who were not lepers themselves. No one could help feeling pity for these lepers. They were so lonely, driven from their homes with no hope of ever being allowed to go back to their friends. They suffered from a dreadful disease which no doctor on earth knew how to cure. All they could do was just wander about from place to place. Continuing with our series on the life of Christ, this story from the Bible is titled Jesus' Last Journey to Jerusalem.
Precious memories.
StudyJesus.com presents Bible Stories with your host, Dr. Joe Jackson. Stories directly from God's holy word, told in easy-to-understand story form that the whole family will enjoy, and featuring the work of a talented artist illustrating each week's story. Now gather the family because it's time for this week's Bible Story.
No matter how much people pitied lepers, there was only one who was actually able to help them. And perhaps these 10 lepers had heard that Jesus of Nazareth could heal any trouble, even their dreadful disease. Maybe they'd heard that he would pass that way, and maybe they were looking for him. And now, when they saw him coming, even from far off, they began to cry out, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." And Jesus, hearing their cry, said, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." They obeyed Jesus, and as they walked along, each one surely looked at the other, and then each one surely looked at his own body. And what great joy! Their skin was no longer dry and white and full of sores. It looked as it had when they were well. Could it actually be true that they were no longer lepers? Yes, it was really true. Jesus had made them well. Now when the Samaritan saw that he was well, he went back to Jesus and, falling down at his feet, thanked him over and over again for making him well. Seeing only this one man, Jesus said, "Weren't there 10 who were cured? And yet none of them have come back to thank God except this stranger, this Samaritan. Where are the 9? And where were those 9 children of Israel who had been made well, hurrying as fast as they could to show themselves to the priest? They longed to hear the priest say that they were well. They longed to live like other people again. They longed so much to be at home with their friends that in their hurry, they forgot to thank Jesus who'd made them well. How different their lives would have been if Jesus hadn't been kind to them. And yet they didn't say one word of thanks to him who had made them well. I wonder if we ever forget to thank God for all that he does for us. As Jesus and his disciples continued on toward Jerusalem, they were joined by other groups of people who were also on their way to the feast of the Passover. And as they walked along together, Jesus taught one lesson after another, and he answered the questions that were asked of him. The Pharisees asked when the kingdom of heaven should come. And Jesus told them that this was a kingdom which would never be seen, for it was in the hearts of those who belonged to it. Here's one of the parables Jesus told on this journey. Two men went up into the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other was a publican. The Pharisee stood proudly with his head up and he said, God, I thank thee that I'm not as wicked as other men are, or even this poor publican here. I go without food twice every week, and I give away 1/10 of everything I own. But the publican, standing out away from the others in the temple, didn't even lift up his eyes toward heaven. He put his hands on his chest and he said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus said, I tell you that God was better pleased with this man than he was with the other who boasted of his good works. Those who are the greatest in their own eyes are often the least in God's eyes. If we're kind and generous to others because we love them, we'll not always be thinking about how good we are to them. As the group passed along the road, little children were brought to Jesus that he might put his hands on them and bless them. The disciples wanted to send these little children away because they thought that Jesus was too busy to be bothered with children. But he wouldn't allow this to be done. Jesus called the little children to him, and laying his hands on them, he said those words that so many children have since then learned, and words which every child loves. Suffer the little children to come unto me, and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus always loved children. Do you remember that time after Jesus' disciples had been quarreling about who was to be the greatest man in the new kingdom that they thought Jesus was going to build in their country? At that point, Jesus took a child in his arms and said that it was only those who were loving and obedient like this child, those who knew they didn't know much and were willing to learn, only those would be members of the kingdom, and that wanting to be great was sure to make them the lowest. When they'd gone a little farther on the road, a young man, a rich man, came up to Jesus and kneeled at his feet, and he said, Good Master, what shall I do that I may have this life that goes on forever? Jesus said to him, Why do you call me good? There's none good but one, and that's God. But if you want to live forever, keep the commandments. You know them. Do not kill, do not steal, do not tell things that are not true, honor your father and mother, love your neighbor as yourself. You know the commandments. The young man answered and said to Jesus, Master, I've kept all these commandments ever since I was a little boy. What more must I do? Jesus knew that this was true, and he said to the young man, If you want to be perfect, go and sell all you have and give it to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. And then come and follow me. Now this young man was very rich and probably cared more for his money than for anything else in the whole world. Jesus knew this, and he knew that until the young man was willing to give up everything that was dearer to him than love for God, he couldn't be a true disciple of Jesus. And so, though Jesus loved the young man, Jesus asked him to do this thing which was so hard for him to do. The young man said no more, but walked away very sad. He felt that he couldn't do what Jesus had asked of him. Turning to the other travelers, Jesus said, How hard it is for people to give up their riches and the things that are dear to them to follow me. And Jesus showed them that it was only when God gave them new hearts that such a thing was possible. Peter then spoke up for himself and the other disciples, and he said, "Lord, we've left all to follow you. What shall we gain by doing it?" And Jesus answered, "There's no man who's left home or parents or friends or wife or children for my sake who shall not receive in this world many times as much as he's lost. And in the world to come, he'll have the life that never ends." And then Jesus told them another story. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who owned a large vineyard, that is, a place where grapes are grown. This man went out very early one morning to find men who would work for him in his vineyard. He found some who agreed to work all day for a Roman penny, which was about what laborers would earn in a day's work at that time in history. About 9 o'clock in the morning, he went out again, and seeing others standing around the marketplace doing nothing, he said, "Look, you can go and work in my vineyard, and whatever is right, I'll pay you." At 12 o'clock and again at 3 o'clock, he did the same thing. Even as late as 5 o'clock in the afternoon, he found men in the marketplace who were doing nothing. He asked them, "Why do you stand here all day, idle?" And they answered him, "Because no man has hired us." And the vineyard owner then told them, as he had the others, that they could work in his vineyard and that he would pay them what was right. In that country, the day was over at sunset, which was usually 6 o'clock. And at that time, work stopped. So when it was time to stop work that evening, the vineyard owner said to one of his head workers, "Call the men in now and pay them for what they've done, beginning with those who came last." The man who'd worked only 1 hour came in, and each of them received a penny. Those who came to work at 3 o'clock were called next, and they also got a penny each. And so did every man who had been at work in the vineyard that day. Now, when those who had been at work since early morning heard that every one of the others had been given the same money, they were angry. They thought that they should be paid more than those who'd only worked a part of the day, and they found fault with the man who'd hired them. The vineyard owner said, "Friends, haven't I given you all that I promised you? I've not wronged you, for you agreed to work for a penny a day. Now take what belongs to you and go on home. Is it not right for me to do as I wish with my own money? Are you angry because I want to be kind to these other men?" In this parable, Jesus taught that God will always reward good, honest work, but not always according to the amount we've done, but according to our willingness to help, just as a mother praises her child for trying to help her, even though the child couldn't do much work or do it very well. Jesus now took his disciples apart from the others, and as they sat together resting, he spoke to them once more about what was going to happen to him. He said, "We're now on our way to Jerusalem, and there I'll be given over to the chief priests and scribes. And they've said I should be put to death at once. But on the third day I'll rise again." It's strange that the disciples didn't understand what Jesus meant, but they didn't. And even at this point, after all the time they'd spent listening to Jesus teach, they were still wondering who would have the highest places in the kingdom. The mother of James and John came to Jesus at this time, and asked that her 2 sons might have the highest places next to Jesus. Lord willing, next time we'll find out what happened and conclude this Bible story titled Jesus' Last Journey to Jerusalem. Precious memories, unseen angels, sent from somewhere to my soul.